This is Adam Lehrhaupt, and welcome to today's episode of Picture This. My guest today is the author of more than 200 books for kids, spanning a wide range of topics from science and nature to research, all different kinds of nonfiction literature. So I'd like everybody to give a hearty round of applause and welcome for Melissa Stewart.
Hi, Adam. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, thank you so much. So here at Picture This, we like to be open to all kinds of new and different things. And the way that you talk about nonfiction stories is, I think it's a little bit different than the way that other people talk about them. It's becoming a little more prevalent, but when I think about nonfiction, typically just say, oh yeah, it's a book where it is just facts, and sometimes it has a story and sometimes it's a list of facts. But you have more concrete, better definitions than that. So can you tell us a little bit about how you describe the nonfiction category?
Sure. I have co-written a book with educator Marlene Correa called Five Kinds of Nonfiction. And so we break the wide world of nonfiction into 5 categories. There's narrative nonfiction, as you mentioned, but then we break expository nonfiction into 4 different groupings. And so one is traditional nonfiction, which is sort of an all-about book with straightforward facts. These are books that have been around since our childhood. But there also are some other categories that either were just very small categories in the past or are brand new within the last 10, 15-ish years. And so there was, as I said before, there was originally traditional nonfiction in the sort of late 1980s, early 1990s. There was a brand new category, which is called Browsable nonfiction. So this started out with Dorling Kindersley when they realized when all of a sudden we had desktop publishing, they were the ones that really understood the capabilities of it. And so they created these books that had tons of information on each page, much of it visual. And so these are the books that you don't necessarily have to read them cover to cover. You can dip in and out, and they are lavishly illustrated with all kinds of photos and little captions, and they have a lot of different headings on each page. They often have a lot of diagrams and other kinds of text features.
What is an example? Like, for me, being of a certain age, for me, that's the Guinness Book of World Records. Like that would be my experience with a book like that. But what are some of the?
Yep, I think that's one example. I think any of the eyewitness books from Dorling Kindersley, many of the National Geographic books also fall into that category. So then the next category that came about was narrative nonfiction in the mid 1990s. And that sort of started in the adult publishing world in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and sort of made its way into children's publishing in around the mid 90s. And then in the early 2000s, there was another new category called expository literature, which is, instead of being kind of an all-about book, so instead of being a book called Rocks or a book called Kangaroos or a book called Volcanoes, there are books that look more at different concepts. And so it might be a book called, for example, I have a book called Feathers, Not Just for Flying. And so it's a book that is about lots of different things that birds do with their feathers other than flying. And so it has something very surprising in it because it sort of changes the way that we think about what feathers can be. So it's looking at a kind of a finely honed concept rather than a big general idea. And then also the fourth category is active nonfiction. And so those are books about how to do something. So how to make origami, how to draw a dinosaur, cooking. So, all kinds of different books. They're often about either learning a skill doing an activity. Sometimes there are books that come packaged with some sort of little model that you can make, and there are instructions in the book for putting it together. So these books all have different characteristics, different features, different formats. And because of that, they can be used in different ways in the classroom. So for example, a traditional nonfiction book is great early in the research process because you're sort of just reading around the topic. So you want to know everything about it, all the facts. And also those books are often written at very grade specific levels. But later in the research process, a browsable nonfiction book could be really helpful because they have so many text features, and they also have a glossary and a table of contents. And so you can find specific bits of information more easily. And often they have tantalizing tidbits that can enrich your writing. If you're focusing on informational writing, expository literature can make a really great mentor text. If you're doing procedural writing, like maybe a science notebook, then an active nonfiction book can really be a great model. So each book has different characteristics and can be used in different ways.
I'm just taking it all in. It's so cool to think about the niches that are starting to be developed around this. Did a lot of that come out of just the reading styles of different students, and just how we process things differently? And maybe somebody who is a little more reluctant, it can get into that expository a little bit better, or somebody who is more wildly imaginative likes a narrative nonfiction. Is that kind of where that came from?
So I think there's sort of a lot to kind of break down in what you just said. I would say that expository nonfiction can 100% be just as imaginative as narrative nonfiction or fiction. I think it also can kind of appeal to emotions also, but they might be different emotions. It might be awe, wonder, curiosity, which are all emotions, but they're not the emotions that we normally think of associating with fiction, let's say.
Yeah, and we see it all the time in fiction writing, right? So a good fiction story is going to instill, heart emotions, as well as, body, I'll call them body emotions, but, like wonder and awe is something that you express with more than just your heart, right? Like we're pulling at heartstrings, but we want to create that sense of wonder and interest, right? However we develop the interest, we want to develop an interest in them, either for reading or for whatever the activity or curriculum aspect it is that that we're trying to bring out, right?
Yeah, but I would say as far as like where the different kinds came from, they actually didn't really come from any kind of reading research. They sort of just materialized out of authors or publishers just trying different things, wanting to be innovative, trying to take the market in new directions so they can capture new kinds of sales. And so it's really sort of this experimentation based on what's possible, physically, conceptually, format wise, more than what kids are wanting or needing. It's sort of kind of a matter of, I guess, putting the cart in front of the horse a little bit. I think absolutely expository nonfiction can appeal to a different kind of reader than a narrative, whether that's narrative nonfiction or fiction. But I think there are also, and I think most readers enjoy most, but there are sort of two, if you imagine it as sort of like a continuum, there's sort of like total fiction lovers, total expository lovers, and then a lot of other people in a lot of different places in between.
It's always a rainbow, right? So
Right.
you have people, and just because one day you like reading fiction doesn't mean the next day you don't like that pure nonfiction, right? So as people are coming into the library or grabbing books off the shelf in the classroom, it really, what they ate that day can affect it, how they're feeling that day. the color of the book, all those different things come into it. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. I think where it gets tricky is that people who are educators, teachers, librarians, book reviewers, editors, all chose their job because, especially literacy educators, they chose their jobs because they have a deep love of stories and storytelling. So they're perhaps at this kind of one end of the continuum. And for a long time, they really didn't realize that there was another end of the continuum. And so they didn't really respect those readers. They thought these kids were reluctant readers, weren't readers. And the truth was they just connect with a different kind of book. And so I think it's really been a learning process over perhaps the last decade where people have started to realize, okay, even though I, as a teacher, might not connect with an expository book, that doesn't mean it's a bad book, or it doesn't mean it's a lower quality book. It just means that my brain works in one way, and I have students whose brains work in a different way. And I need to recognize those kids and feed them the books that can nourish them.
So with 200 books out, what are some ways that you connect your books with educators and librarians and parents even, that are unique, or that they can then take and use to more open up the underserved areas of this reading spectrum?
I think really one of the things that a lot of people sort of call me a nonfiction advocate. And I think one of sort of my missions as a writer, or as a human being even, is to sort of help educators and kids understand that there is this broad range and ways to try kind of, have it like a menu of different kinds of books, and to give kids an opportunity to try each ones to figure out which ones they really gravitate toward, which formates. But then the truth is, we want all kids, all humans, to be lifelong readers who can engage with any kind of text. And so we want to recognize at a young age, okay, this kid is an expository lover. How can we help them stretch and grow and become comfortable with narratives, and vice versa? And so what are the books that can bridge that gap? How can we create books that will strongly serve one audience or the other when they're just sort of learning to read and becoming comfortable with just sort of the skill? But then how can we help them kind of stretch and grow and be able to interact successfully with a broad range of books?
So is there any benefit to looking at, it's very easy to connect nonfiction with STEM activities in the classroom. Like that's a no-brainer. But trying to find, in knowing that we were going to talk today, I was trying to find ways that I could connect nonfiction to other things that you might not, that it would make a natural connection to. But if you have a really good fiction picture book that has some really good SEL qualities, where somebody is connecting in a unique and different way. So connecting to a bird like to a book like Feathers, where here's a different way to think about this thing, right? So you think about feathers, you think about, oh, you use them for flying. But in thinking about feathers in a different way, you can connect to a social emotional learning moment, where it's, instead of thinking about everything in a straight line, think about it differently. How would you approach this situation differently? The same way we're thinking in this book about feathers.
The art created by Sarah Brandon is so beautiful. She tries to really bring the idea of, sketching and art appreciation. And so I think you can also access the book in that way. If you're a kid that loves art and drawing, I think that there's 100%. But I also think you don't have to use every book in every way, right? I mean, I think you can have a book, and so this is something that maybe a child will just pick up because they're curious. Maybe they'll pick it up because they love birds. Maybe they'll pick it up because they saw a feather on the ground the other day. Or you can use it in a science lesson. You can also use it in an English arts lesson. One of the properties of this book that makes it kind of unique is that it really makes heavy use of similes. So you can use it to teach different language arts devices. So there's a lot of different ways to access it.
So to go back to the different types of nonfiction, is there a particular one that resonates with you, or do you take the subject matter that you feel like writing about and just allow that to dictate where you're going?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have written all 5 types, but sort of my favorite is expository literature. And that's sort of, I think most of my books, especially in recent years, have fallen into that category. I think that category has also had a surge in popularity in recent years. And so a lot of people are experimenting with it and trying new things. I think they're also doing innovative things with other kinds of nonfiction too. I think it's sort of, a lot of people are saying this is the golden age of nonfiction for kids. And I really think that's true. There's more vibrant and vital, than it ever has been before.
So when we think about expository nonfiction, what are some actionable tips that we could give to educators or homeschoolers or librarians for incorporating that more into their lesson plans, or presenting them in a way that encourages that little bit of interest that you're talking about?
Yeah, so most educators, most classrooms are doing a unit on informational writing. And so what is informational writing is essentially expository literature. It also, within that, you also get some other kinds of nonfiction, but when people are talking about, finely crafted informational writing, they're mostly talking about expository literature. And so you can use expository literature books to teach all the different things kids are supposed to know: language devices, strong verbs, text structures. So that's one thing about expository literature. It can have any text structure that you can think of, whereas narrative nonfiction is almost always a sequence text structure. Traditional nonfiction is almost always a description text structure. So those expository literature books have rich language. So there's a lot there in terms of being able to use it in the classroom for ELA instruction.
Yeah, and there's a lot of opportunity to structure different segments of those lessons around those writing, there's different writing structures. So you can do a rhyming lesson around creating a nonfiction, or you can do, something that's more lyrical and experiment with the different writing styles.
Yeah. So you're right. You could bring in voice, but you could also have a lesson that's purely about text structures, talk about compare and contrast versus problem and solution versus sequence. So you can also talk about text features with any of the kinds of nonfiction.
Yeah, and I like the idea of playing with all of those different layers, to use my Schick quote, it's like an onion, and you can peel off the layers. You have metaphor and simile, and then you have, all of these different, verbs, and, write this using, adjectives, and, peel all those layers and see all the different kinds of things you can create just around that one thing. And if it is something that that your student is passionate about, and you let them pick it, maybe it's about a Snickers bar, and here's some facts about a Snickers bar, and they get to create their own expository writing around that, and they get to pick all those different things, whichever ones speak to them.
Right, absolutely. I think on my website I have a lot of materials too. So for example, for the book Ken and Aardvark Bark, I have activity sheets where they can take that book. Has one text structure, but then there are prompts to kind of switch it into a different text structure. And I have a lot of those different kinds of activities on my website. I actually have a Kids Love Nonfiction site that has specific subsections for parents and teachers and librarians. So there's really a lot of resources there that people can check out if they want to.
That's excellent. I'm gonna have to check that one out. I've been working up ideas around an aardvark and an armadillo. So I've been doing aardvark research lately, and wow, such interesting creatures.
They are.
So this is the part where we get into a couple of standard things that I do. And one is Adam's book bag. And this is where I ask people to recommend a picture book, and it can be yours, it can be somebody else's, and just some interesting ways that you've either seen it used in lessons or seen it presented, or ways that you presented that kind of really resonated. And it can be just a go-to book that you hold up as an example when you're talking about things.
So one book that I like to use in that way is this book, Mega Predators of the Past. And I like to really talk about this book. And so this is an expository literature book. It's a list book with a compare and contrast text structure. But I like to really have kids read it and analyze it and break it down and see that it actually has the same structure as a 5-paragraph essay, which is something that is very important in schools. But, and a lot of people say, well, it's not really an authentic form of writing, but it can be. And so this book is sort of like a 12-paragraph essay because it has 12 spreads about, or I guess 13 spreads about 13 different creatures, but each one sort of functions as its own kind of, some of them are 2 paragraphs, but it's like as a cohesive unit. So with a 5-paragraph essay, you have an introduction and a conclusion, and then in the middle, you have 3 examples. So here you sort of have 12 examples, but if you look at the first spread, you can clearly see how it's an introduction, and you can break apart the different paragraphs and see exactly what the use is. And then if you go to the end, you can see how there's a conclusion that sort of just echoes that introduction. And so by breaking down this book, kids can see it's a really engaging, fun, humorous, kind of almost snarky text. It's sarcastic, but you can see how it really fits that, that format of writing that they're required to do for the tests that they're taking, and to see how what they're doing in class can be expanded into a real world kind of book that they really enjoy reading.
Yeah. So it directly connects something that they do in school to a career, right? So this is what I do. I write 5-paragraph essays, and then they make them into books. And that's what you're doing. So being able to say what you're doing is what I do, we're the same, is a really, it's a really cool connection, and something that hopefully gets them jazzed to do, a little bit more of.
Yeah, and I try to make that connection all the time. When I talk about research, I talk about the ways that I get information are very similar to the ways that they get information, and how they could easily kind of pivot what they're doing in research in a way that might make it a more engaging process for them. So many times I'll run into, 6th, 7th graders who think that research is boring. And it's because in elementary school, their research experiences have been boring. But there are ways that you can bring kind of the passion and like the treasure hunt aspect of research into the elementary classroom to help kids see that the quest for knowledge is a fun pursuit. It's a treasure hunt.
Yeah. And you can do stuff with that treasure, right? So when you go and you find a really cool piece of knowledge, you're going to hang on to it, and you're going to bring it home, and you're going to talk about it at dinner, right?
Absolutely.
So the next thing that I usually ask is for a creative prompt. So it's not necessarily a writing prompt, but it can be, but something that teachers can use to spark student engagement. So we just talked about how really encouraging fun nonfiction activities at that elementary school age can lead to a better love of that as they grow up. How can we give, like, what kind of creative thing or what kind of little nudges can we pass to educators now to help them spark that engagement at those early ages?
So I'm going to talk about something that I think it's not exactly what you have in mind, but I actually think it
That's okay.
kind of
We're very open here.
So right behind me, I know your listeners can't hear me, but behind me behind me is my writing desk, and above that I have a bulletin board that I call my idea board. And so anytime I hear something interesting, I read something interesting, I write it down on a little scrap of paper and I stick it up there. And the reason that's so important for all writers, whether they're young writers or professional writers, is that even though ideas are around us all the time, the trick is being able to keep track of them so that we can access them easily when it's time to write. And so that's how I use my idea board. So when I go into schools, I'll ask kids, how many of you struggle to come up with an idea? And pretty much everyone will raise their hand. And I've actually been in schools where they have said that that is the most challenging part of the nonfiction writing process. And so what I like to encourage schools and kids and classrooms to do is most of them have a writer's notebook, and on the inside back cover or the last page to create what I call an idea incubator. And so an idea incubator is essentially like my idea board. So anytime a kid hears something interesting, encounters a fun fact, is curious, they have a question, to write it down and keep it warm in that idea incubator. And then when it's time to write, they have a whole bunch of ideas right there that they can draw on. They can also talk with a partner, brainstorm some more ideas based on what's there. And the other thing is that often teachers will give sort of an umbrella topic. Like, let's say the class is studying the Revolutionary War, and the teacher says, okay, everyone's going to write about the Revolutionary War. And so kids might be like, what am I going to write about? What am I going to write about? And so maybe what pops into their head is George Washington, or maybe what pops into their head is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Or, if they live in one of the Revolutionary War states, they might think of a battle that happened in their state. And so, that could be interesting. But what if we could really tap into kids' passion? So what if they went back to their idea incubator and they said, okay, I'm really interested in the weather. What was the weather like during the Revolutionary War? It turns out it was a really snowy time in history, and that absolutely affected some of the battles. What if a kid is really interested in fashion? What were the soldiers wearing? It turns out many of the American soldiers were marching without boots, and they had to march through the snow. So that's a pretty interesting thing to know. What if they're interested in cooking? Well, what were they eating? So kids can take whatever is their passion and they can bring it to any topic, and that will make the project more interesting to them. It will make their writing more engaging, and when they're done, they can actually share what they've been doing with their class, and the whole class will develop a more well-rounded view of the Revolutionary War than they would have if everyone had just done George Washington.
Yeah, because seeing it through everybody's different lens gives you a more holistic view. So the idea incubator, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to collect all the information we talked about here. I'll put ideas for activities together to connect to this episode. So for those of you who know, you know where to find it. For those of you who are new to Picture This, there will be a link below this episode that will take you to the activities that we've talked about, and specifically the really cool idea incubator that Melissa just brought up, which I really like. I wrote a book called Idea Jar.
Oh, well, I talk about idea jars too, right?
So Idea Jar is basically just all the ideas in the idea jar were there and nobody was doing anything with them. So they break out of the idea jar and they get all over the classroom, and then the the audience that you're reading to needs to tell the story to get the ideas back in the jar. So there's these images in there that really don't have anything, right? So it's just, here's an image. It doesn't say what's going on in the story. So it's up to the reader or the audience to tell that part of the story so that we can move on to the next page. So
Awesome.
I love how the incubator takes this to a whole new level. But yeah, the idea jar, I have whole, lesson plans that go with the idea jar, how to make an idea jar, all that stuff exists. So I'll link to that as well. And then you had said you have activities and things on your website. So I will link to those so that people can go and experience all of those activities as well as everything else. So I want to thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me today. I mean, we could talk forever, but I promised everybody I would try to keep these short so you could listen to it on your way to school or your way home. So I'm trying to keep my episodes to a certain length. I fail all the time, but that is part of the creative process, and it's a good thing for people to learn. Any other things that you want to share about nonfiction and again, just fostering a love for it in the classroom?
I think one resource that I'd like to point your viewers toward, there's an organization, many of them are probably familiar with it, called the National Council for Teachers of English. And they, in 2003, ratified a nonfiction position statement. And if you just Google NCTE nonfiction position statement, it will pop right up. But I think that's a really great resource for any educator to look at.
Awesome. I will put a link to that, and maybe I'll find some activities around that statement that we can link to as well. So again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Please stop by, visit Melissa's website, check out everything that she's doing, check out her resources. Remember, we wouldn't be here if you weren't listening to us. So please like, share, comment. Let us know what you're doing with nonfiction in your classroom. Share your ideas and really enjoy it and help the community out.